Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Talk of the Town as we begin our third season. Michael Jacobi with you. We're going to do an hour today on a fascinating subject. An old pal of mine, Duffy Jennings, is here. How are you, buddy?
Michael, great to see you.
And he's probably a pal of a lot of you folks. You owned Los Gatos Magazine,
I
right?
started Los Gatos
You started
Magazine.
Los Gatos Magazine. You invented Los Gatos Magazine.
I think it was 2013, as I recall.
Okay.
And ran it for a couple of years till I moved away from Los Gatos.
Right.
It was one
And,
of the
it's still in
decisions I
business.
regret for a little while.
Well, it's still in business with our buddy Rich. They're
Yes,
still
absolutely.
doing well. And we're
It's a
delighted
terrific
for them.
magazine.
Well, you have moved on from a magazine owner to an author. You've been a writer your whole life.
True.
Your book, Reporter's Notebook, which we have right here, is just a fascinating story about your years at the Chronicle in the late 70s.
Well, throughout the 70s,
Throughout the
starting
70s.
in 1969.
I mean, and we talk so much about the turmoil of the 60s with RFK and King and Malcolm. But the 70s and beyond Vietnam, the 70s opened in Vietnam and was really a transitional decade, and no more than in San Francisco. And we're going to talk about that. But first, a little background, which I found fascinating that you went into in the book. You had, I don't want to use the word strange, but I'm going to, a strange upbringing. And you were in a very...
It was different.
It was different. It
Yes.
was different. Your mom owned a gay bar,
Yes,
a heavy drinker,
correct.
correct? Your dad?
My father was a lifelong newspaperman, columnist, magazine writer, and book author.
Okay. And he passed away relatively early in your life?
Yeah, I was only 22,
Okay.
and my parents split up when I was 3.
Okay.
So my mom was basically a single mom who had gone to Stanford in the same class of 1934 with Hewlett and Packard,
Really?
and was an English grad at the age of 19.
Okay.
She was a very gifted young lady, and she went into publicity and writing, not writing so much on her own, but working. One of her first jobs was for George Palmer Putnam, who is a well-known publisher, but also well-known as the husband of Amelia Earhart.
Yes.
And it was working with Putnam that she met my father in the late 30s. And at the time, he was working at the Chronicle, and by 1951 had taken over Herb Cain's column spot as one of several.
Which Herb Cain obviously hadn't started yet.
No, Herb Cain had defected, if you will, to
really?
the Examiner between 1950 and 1958.
I didn't know that. Okay.
And in that time period, the Chronicle tried a half a dozen different columnists to sort of replicate whatever Herb Cain was doing. And my father had it for about 2 years. He called it It's News to Me, but it was the same kind of man about town gossip column. And my parents got together right about, actually in the late 30s. But when I was born in the late 40s, and my father was at the paper, my mother would bring me into the Chronicle in a basket that Herb Cain, who was, before he went over to the Examiner, would carry me around the newsroom and say, look at Dean and Dory's newest baby. So
That is
I've actually
wonderful.
been at the Chronicle since I was born.
Did you stay close to your dad?
Not very.
Okay.
No, and the book, and my book is actually 2 stories. There's the story of my years in the 70s covering all the major stories of that time: Moscone milk killings, Dan White trial, Patty Hearst kidnapping, the Zodiac and Zebra murders, all of that. But the backstory again is about my mother leaving her 9-to-5 bank job with 2 young sons to buy a bar in a very upscale neighborhood of San Francisco in Presidio Heights. And was not doing very well, and decided to open it as a gay bar in 1961. So
I mean, this is right in the middle of Stonewall and all
it was
that.
8 years before Stonewall, and it was a part of San Francisco where there were no gay bars. Most of them
But
then,
a brilliant move.
well,
as an
her
entrepreneur.
business partner who had owned a grocery store on Polk Street understood and had a lot of customers that
We're closeted,
gay
yeah.
men were lonely. They had disposable income, and very few had families, so they spent their evenings in bars.
Now, did she have a lot of run-ins with the police?
She had some run-ins with the police. At that time, several things. State law prohibited a woman from tending bar unless she owned the place. So
Really?
she got by that as the owner. But she liked.
My God, we've gotten progressive, haven't we?
She liked tending bar, and she was motherly in a way to a lot of her customers who had come out of the Midwest and they were afraid of either being outed and banished by their parents. And so they were streaming out into San Francisco, and they would find my mother Dory behind the bar giving out, motherly comfort and advice along with the cocktails. So it became extremely popular. The other problem was it was a very harshly anti-homosexual environment at the time. You could not even hold another man's hand in public or dance with another man or someone of the same sex in public or even in a bar. So the cops would come and harass my mother, and they'd at 1 a.m. and shining flashlights in the faces of the customers coming out and threaten them with all kinds of stuff. And my mother didn't care for any of this. She was not having it, and she had her own flashlight, and she'd go out and flash them into the cops' eyes and say, "You leave my customers alone."
I love
And
it.
eventually, things settled down. The cops became more comfortable. Pretty soon, they're in there having their coffee royales.
Did you bust tables as a kid? Did you
No,
work
I
in
did
a bar?
not.
You never worked
It
in
was
a
a very
bar?
strange experience because I was a very straight adolescent kid first in middle school and then in high school while this was going on. So I didn't understand it. Certainly, it was a critical environment for homosexuals. They were pariahs in society at that time. So I didn't really. My older brother and I were both very confused about this, and we'd have to run errands and maybe go, deliver some groceries or pick things up. Sometimes we had to actually pick our mother up off the floor of the bar. It was very difficult, and we were essentially raising ourselves from about age 13, 14 on.
When did you lose your mother?
She ran the place from 1961 until the mid-'70s, ended up opening another gay bar called Jackson's down near Fisherman's Wharf, but she left the business in the late 70s, and by 1980 she was in the advanced stages of cirrhosis and emphysema and passed away in 81, so I was 33 at that time.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to Lowell High School.
Okay.
I went to
So
City
you
College.
grew up in the city?
I grew up I was born in the marina, in the city.
Was Johnny Mathis Lowell?
No, he was Washington, George Washington
okay.
High School, and several years ahead.
Okay.
But I was born in the city. I grew up in the marina and went to public school for elementary and middle school there. And then for high school, I went to Lowell High School across town at that time out near Jonestown.
And you bought a couple of houses in the marina when you were a kid, just as speculative.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you love it? Where college?
My mother actually bought a pair of Victorian flats when I was 9 years old.
Yeah.
And she was smart enough to make that investment. So it was worth a lot of money. Even when she passed away, it was worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
That pair of flats today is worth almost $3 million.
Yeah, I can well believe it. Where'd you go to college?
So the question of college is something I address in the book because 98% of the graduates of Lowell High School end up going to Harvard, Yale, Northwestern, Stanford, Cal. And the day I graduated from high school, I had no interest in going to college, partly because I had no mother, no parent who were helping guide me through this process, and I really didn't care. I did go to City College for a year. Then I had to join the Marines because my draft status was not good because my grades were so bad.
Well, that's clever. Just join the Marines instead of getting drafted.
Well, I joined for
getting
6
drafted
months.
for 2 and joined for 4.
It was a bad time. It was 1966.
Yeah.
The war was
Just
ramping
before,
up.
What with Tet was 68, I think.
Yes. So, when I came back from the active duty, I got a job in a grocery store, and I had no idea what I was going to do next. And my mother said to me one day, I told her I was not happy, and she said, "Well, why don't you just go down to the Chronicle and get a job?"
Now, did you know all those guys growing up? I mean, even though your dad and your mom were divorced?
Not really, no.
Okay. So the fact that your dad had been there, did it make any difference getting on? It was an
No, what
intern,
made
you
a
know?
difference was that in my mother's class was also the city editor, the longtime city editor of the Chronicle named Abe Mellenkoff.
Okay.
So I called him up, and he said, "Sure, come on down, let's talk." And I went down the next day, and it was amazing just to walk in, see this environment. He said, it turns out we have an opening for a copy boy. If you want, you can start tomorrow. It's $62 a week. This is March of 1967.
Now, we're talking to Duffy Jennings, by the way, author of Reporter's Notebook. San Francisco in the 70s, I mean, we often talk about New York in the old days where there were 22 daily newspapers. How many at the peak was San Francisco?
Maybe 5.
5. And in the 70s, how many were left?
Essentially, it was down to 2.
2, okay.
By that time, the Chronicle and the Examiner. There had been the News call bulletin, the call bulletin. So,
all right, 1970, you start there. I graduated from high school in 1970, and let's chronologically, matter of fact, oddly enough, we did a show last year, I think, with John Lester, who was involved in the Hearst kidnapping and the spokesperson.
Yeah.
He was with KGO and the spokesperson for the Hearst family. That was around 74, 75?
she was kidnapped February 4th, 1974.
74. And you were involved in that story?
I had already been reporting for several years by that time. It's important, Michael, I think, to understand, as you mentioned earlier, the late 60s and the change that started really with the Summer of Love and the infusion of young people into San Francisco in 67. And then by 1968, we endured all of these tragedies that, Martin Luther King, Kennedy, the Pueblo, the USS Pueblo was seized. And then later that fall, of course, the riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and ultimately Nixon gets elected president in November.
So and then the Manson killings.
And Manson killings came in 1969. And by 1969, the tide was really turning in society and culture to a more counterculture environment. Now we started to see a lot of issues like Black Power, Black Panthers, Huey Newton, women's rights and feminism and that issue. Anti-war demonstrations started up. I mean, it had sort of had an early start at Berkeley in the 60s, but now we had People's Park and we had San Francisco State had riots. And so by middle of 1969, things were really turning sour for San Francisco and the Bay Area in a socio-political and cultural way.
Talk a little bit about your first big story you were involved in chronologically.
It was interesting. My first day as a reporter, so I'd been a copy boy for a couple of years. I freelanced a couple of articles for the Sunday Datebook Pink section.
And you get a byline for that?
I got some bylines for that. Right. By John Stanley, our old friend who ran the Pink section, and an old Creature Features guy. Right. A great mentor, still around, just spoke to him last week. So I finally got a tryout. The city editor says, called me up, he said, I kind of like the stuff you're doing in Datebook. How much vacation do you get at Christmas? I said, 3 weeks. He said, all right, well, I need some vacation relief. I'll give you a chance to see what you can do for 3 weeks as a reporter. So my first day was December 1, 1969. And I walk in the office, and I had some good editor support and some mentors there. And the assignment editor, an old Marine gunnery sergeant named Dick Hemp, said, I've got just a story for you today. It is the first day of the Vietnam Draft Lottery, where they're picking these numbers out of this big drum in Washington, D.C.
It's the only lottery I ever won.
Exactly. And he says, I want you to find a kid who's number one, whose birthday was picked number one, somewhere here in the Bay Area, and go out and talk to him. So how do you do this? I mean, this is 19 years earlier.
You go to Toronto.
Well, of course. You understand that the newspaper in those days used to print the birth notices every day. The name of the child, the name of the parents, the town they're from, and what hospital it was. And then the library kept a file of those all the time. So I went back to the library, said, show me the birth notices from September 14, 1950. And I pulled out a list that had 9 boys plus girls. And I just took a reverse directory and started going down the list and cold calling these numbers, these families, and saying, I'm looking for your son. And I finally, after about 6 or 7, I got to a family, a mom who answered the phone and said, oh yeah, Mike, he's up at USF. He's in the dorm. I'll tell you how to find him. So I got sent up there with a photographer. And as happens sometimes, a good story turns into a better story, because there's a whole dormitory full of young college kids scared to death that they're about to be drafted.
I remember that evening.
And there's a big bulletin board up, and every number that gets they're putting it up there, and half the guys are, oh my God, and the other half are going, yeah. And so I talked to this guy, Mike, and he was kind of freaked out. And then I met some friends of his. We talked some more. So I had a pretty good story. They took some pictures. I went back to the office. I wrote the story. I turned it in, and I went home. And the next morning, I walk out on my front porch to get my Chronicle, and I'm open the paper, and I thumb through, and I get to page 11, and there's my story with my name on it on my first day as a reporter. This is unheard of.
Sure.
And it frankly ticked off a lot of veterans who had worked months to get a byline in the paper. So that's how it started, and it just took off from there. I got good story assignments, the rest of the time, and eventually I started to become friends with Paul Avery, who was the reporter that covered the Zodiac murders in 68, 69. And I kind of learned a little bit at his knee as a police reporter because I was a young guy. And so over time, he and I worked together on that. You know, the movie version of Zodiac came out in 2007.
It was Robert Downey Jr.
It was Robert Downey Jr. and what I thought was an Oscar-worthy performance. But they all did very good. David Fincher did a super job on recreating the Chronicle newsroom.
Is Zodiac still alive?
Who knows?
Does anybody?
No, he's never caught.
No one has any
Never
idea.
caught. The movie and the book focused on one particular guy. He's long since dead. They thought maybe DNA could find him. There's talk now about these new methods of DNA going to relatives and how they found that Sacramento rapist killer through a sister. But here we are. This October 11th will be the 50th anniversary of the only San Francisco murder and the last murder committed by Zodiac, and people are still looking for him.
Amazing, amazing. The book is Reporter's Notebook, Duffy Jennings, and it's a fascinating story. We don't have enough time in an hour to touch on all these subjects, but we're going to take a little break and get back and talk about something that you were intimately involved with, Moscone and the Harvey Milk trial, Moscone assassination, and we'll talk a little bit about Jonestown. You're watching Talk of the Town. I'm Michael Jacobi, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to a very special edition of Talk of the Town. I'm Michael Jacobi. With me, Duffy Jennings, former Chronicle reporter from the 70s. It's not like a time warp. He's been here all the time. He just didn't show up. The book is called Reporter's Notebook. Really, literally and figuratively, you take the headlines from the 70s in the Bay Area, and they touched you in a very personal way and a professional way. Let's talk. One of the things I read in your book, and as I said, I'm about a third of the way through, is Jonestown, and you're taking the phone call. Talk about a little bit about that.
The Jonestown tragedy, if you will, when Congressman Leo Ryan and a few of his supporters and several media people flew to Guyana to his camp down there to see what was going on, to investigate complaints that people were being held against their will. The Chronicle had written a lot about Jim Jones while he was in San Francisco.
Did you know Jim Jones, or did you meet him when
I met Jim
when
Jones
he was in the city?
When he was working in the city, because I was covering City Hall.
Did you have a suspicion? Was he?
No, not at all.
No,
but
just charming.
Other people at the Chronicle who spent more time on that, and I was doing other things, tried to write more critical stories about Jim Jones, but in some cases were turned down because some of our editors were actually attending the services at People's Temple, and because he'd been appointed to city board by Mayor Moscone, and so he had an air of legitimacy about him. Plus, he had used a lot of his flock, if you will, to turn out the vote for Mayor Moscone and other Democrats in San Francisco. So he was seen as a political asset to them. And yet there was this strange activity going on at the services and whatever. In any event, we had a reporter, a colleague of mine about my age named Marshall Kilduff, who started to do some investigative work on what was going on with People's Temple, and tried to convince our editors that we needed to be a little bit more, dig down a little more deep to see what was happening there, and was turned down. So we ended up freelancing an article in a New West magazine that tended to open a lot of serious questions about Jim Jones. So Jones, because of this scrutiny, moved all of his people to this jungle encampment in Guyana. So when Congressman Ryan and his group, which included Jackie Spear as his young aide, and others went down there, the Chronicle just wanted to send someone along as well. They didn't want to send Marshal Kilduff because there had been threats and there was some concern about his own safety. They asked another.
And then somebody couldn't go, right?
Then they asked another guy named Jerry Carroll, who said, "Geez, guys, it's my anniversary that weekend. I'm going to be in Carmel." And so there was a third reporter who's fairly new to the paper named Ron Javers, who said, "Okay, I'll go." So he went along with Tim Reiterman from the Examiner and an NBC crew, TV crew from L.A. with a reporter named Don Harris and his camera crew. And the Examiner had a photographer as well. The Chronicle did send a photographer. So to kind of shorten the story is that when the group was leaving and Jones sent his ambush squad to attack
on flatbeds.
On
right?
flatbed trucks.
With automatic weapons.
On this little dirt airstrip in Port Kaituma, Guyana, and the truck rolled up, and these guys with guns stood up and opened fire on the group boarding two small planes. Ryan was killed almost immediately. Jackie Spear was shot 5 times. So Ron Javers, who had gone for the Chronicle, was shot in the shoulder, and they all fell to the ground. And he was laying there, in fact, when these gunmen came up closer and delivered coup de grace shots to Ryan and to Don Harris, the NBC guy, and his cameraman. And there was some kind of a break when they weren't looking that Ron and Tim Reiterman jumped up and ran about 100 yards into the jungle, where they hid in waist-deep water overnight till all the gunmen had left and they felt it was safe to come out. And then they came out and saw what was left. There were 5 people dead. There were others injured. And so then they hid in the jungle, and finally the Guyanese authorities became aware of it. Which was an hour's flight from the capital. So finally, Ron gets picked up and along with the other people by military aircraft because a congressman has been killed, and they're all flown to the Air Force base in Maryland. But in the meantime, there's a refueling stop. Well, because this happened on a Saturday, there were no Chronicle people on board because they didn't produce the Sunday paper at that time. Only the Examiner did. So nobody really knew, and we didn't have instant communication. Right. So it was basically 2 days before we really had a sense of what had happened.
So the reporter calls you, though.
He calls into the paper.
Take down the story.
He calls into the paper to dictate his personal story of being in this ambush. And on Sunday, 2 days later, during a refueling stop in Puerto Rico.
And this is right out of the front page and Walter Winchell and Stop.
Oh,
here's what's going on.
It was
Stop.
huge.
Yeah.
It was a huge story globally. And so the editor said to me, "Duffy, Ron's on the phone. He's okay. He wants to dictate a story. I want you to take the call." So I get on the phone and I said, "Jesus, Ron, how are you? Are you okay? What happened?" He says, "I'm all right." He says, "I took one in the shoulder. I'm okay. I don't have much time. We need to get started right away." So he starts to dictate to me what it was like standing there in the airport strip and getting shot and what happened there. So I detail all of this in the book. I didn't cover Jonestown, but everybody at the Chronicle was shocked by this. Reporters didn't get shot or killed back then, and we just didn't know that even then that 900 people had committed suicide shortly after this event or been murdered for refusing to drink the Kool-Aid kind of cyanide-laced drink that Jones gave them all. So, but Ron survived, and he dictated this story, which to me was just so, I could barely type. It was so riveting, and the adrenaline was going so much that this guy's talking about what it was like to be there and seeing people's faces blown off or whatever it was.
It's interesting. You talk about Jim Jones and being involved in city government. San Francisco has a history of those kind of things happening. We turned to Dan White. Dan White, who was an elected supervisor,
yes,
and correct me if I'm wrong, got frustrated
Yes.
was not happy
So
when
Dan
Harvey
was
Milk was
a
elected.
conservative guy
Conservative
elected
guy.
in a conservative district.
Got along with Harvey Milk, though. I mean,
Yes.
they knew each other, got along with Moscone.
Harvey went to his kid's christening.
Right, and got just frustrated and quit, and then realized, well, maybe I don't want to quit. It turned in his resignation.
Correct.
Moscone, this is where I may be vague, Moscone accepted it, and then he said, I don't want my resignation, I want to withdraw it, and
Dan
it
White
didn't
did.
go through the supervisors, so it wasn't official, and Moscone was going to turn it over and have him come back.
Yes, but then
What happened?
Harvey Milk got involved because Dan White's vote was a vote that turned the board to a conservative that had John Barbagelata. They had other city interested people, big business people. But Harvey convinced Moscone to appoint a more liberal candidate. It was a guy named Don Horanzi. He was a government housing official.
Now, did Dan White know about this conversation?
Not until the night before
The murders.
Horanzi was to be appointed to the board. So that would on the night of November 26, 1978, a reporter called Dan White at home and said, Moscone is going to name someone else. What do you have to say about this? And he got really mad and he hung up on her. Barbara Taylor, the longtime City Hall reporter for KCBS, hung up on her. And he'd had a lot of pressure on himself because he was making $9,600 a year as a supervisor, but he had a wife and a young baby. He had a concession at Pier 39 called Hot Potato. It took a lot of his time, and he just felt a lot of pressure. I couldn't do the job that the conservative people in his district had expected him to be able to do. It included fire and police, and he'd been a policeman, he'd been a fireman, he'd been an Army paratrooper. So he felt a lot of community pressure. That's why he wanted his job back, and now he finds out that he feels that Moscone betrayed him by promising to let him have it back and then appointing another guy.
So it's after hours. He heads down to City Hall. There was
No. So the next morning. The next morning, he goes down to City Hall. So it's 11 o'clock in the morning. It's a Monday morning.
But wasn't there no check-in system for the supervisors? They could just come in a side door?
So what happened, Michael, is at the main entrance on both sides of the building, there was a metal detector. And supervisors routinely would park in a ramp on the sides of the building and go in through a basement door, which is what he did.
With no security.
And yet, no security, and yet the door was locked, and he had to get it. There was an engineer who saw him and actually opened a window so he could climb in and the engineer said, "Hey, Dan, great to see you." And he just walked past him and then went up to the mayor's office where he, interestingly enough, Willie Brown had just left a meeting with the mayor. And we find out years later that Willie Brown was also on Dan White's target list, but White didn't see him. He got in to see Moscone. They had a few words in a back room. He shot Moscone 4 times, including 2 in the back of the head. He walked out a side door and across the building to the other side of City Hall where the supervisor's offices are, reloading en route. And he walked into the supervisor's office and he passed by Dianne Feinstein, who was the president of the board at that time. And she said, "Dan, could I see you a minute?" Probably to talk to him about the new member who was going to be appointed in his place later that afternoon. And White said, "Not right now, Dianne, I have something else I went to do." He went into Harvey Milk's office and said, "Harvey, could I see you a minute?" And Harvey walked with him back over to Dan White's old office where he shot Harvey 5 times, including one in the wrist as Harvey put up his hands, and the same 2 coup de grace on the back of the head, and then walked out of the building. Dianne Feinstein hears the shots and smells the smoke and comes running down to find Harvey Milk laying on the floor in a pool of blood, tries to take his pulse, and ends up putting her finger through the hole in his wrist. Now, I'd say that's a pretty good experience under fire for someone like Dianne Feinstein, who, of course, ultimately becomes mayor because of that.
Not to mention the whole metaphor side, but it's...
But first, as soon as the shots are fired, I'm sitting in my desk at the Chronicle. The police department, our guy at the police department, hears us on the radio, calls in the city desk, shots fired at City Hall. The same guy that assigned me to the draft thing says, Duffy, shots at City Hall, get going right away. And a photographer joins me. Now, this is a guy who was 75 years old, had covered stories with my father and Clem Albers. We go hustling up to City Hall. We arrive with dozens of other reporters. There's cars from everywhere, sirens screaming.
Did press
crazy.
have much easier access then than they do
We had
now?
credentials.
And, yeah, but just
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, at that point, they weren't worried about metal detectors.
and we had a lockdown going at City Hall.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
But press could get in. A lot of other people were leaving the building,
Right.
the workers there.
Now, has Diane made her famous statement?
No,
at this
not yet.
point? Okay.
So I get there. I see a lot of other reporters there, a lot of names that people who've been around a long time will recognize from TV and radio, Ed Arno and Peter Cleveland and just a whole number of others, guys and gals that I name in the book are there, other reporters. And nobody's sure what's going on. The police won't talk. All the doors are shut. Every time we ask a question, no one will say anything. Moscone's press secretary, a guy named Mel Wax, who had been the anchor at KQED newsroom for a long time, couldn't find him. Tried to go over to the supervisor's office, cops there, no entry, no word, no nothing. So for about an hour, there's chaos running around. Nobody's sure what's happened. Eventually, we kind of hear 2 people have been shot. We don't know who. Finally, we hear announcement in the hall in 5 minutes at the top of the rotunda stairs in City Hall. So we scramble out there, all the reporters. There's probably 24 of us with cameramen and lights. And I'm standing there in this group, and Dianne Feinstein comes out. She's got this horrible expression on her face, just a gaze like nothing I'd ever seen before. And she's got the police chief over here on one side. He's in civilian clothes. And over here is another aide of hers on the other side. It literally looks like they're holding her up. She's just has this horrified expression on her face, and she looks and just stares and doesn't say anything. And suddenly I get this impression that she's looking at me.
Yeah.
But I think, oh, that's crazy. We're all out here. She's looking at everybody. And then she makes the famous statement that you can see on YouTube where she announces that as the president of the Board of Supervisors, it's my duty to announce that Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed. There's a huge gasp collectively that goes up from the crowd. Right. She can't talk above the noise. Finally, she said, the suspect is Supervisor Dan White, and she turns around and walks back into the supervisor's offices. A year later, she does an interview about the anniversary with another Chronicle reporter, and then says, I couldn't talk. I didn't know what to say. I saw Duffy Jennings. He has this innocent face. He's got these blue eyes. I had to just focus on something in order to gather myself enough to say those words.
And you've run into her since then.
I have.
Yeah.
I saw her at the 30th anniversary of the event, and she actually asked me to be part of a press gathering then. And then just a few years ago, she came to a retirement party for the longtime Chronicle science writer David Perlman, who, don't know why he quit, he was only 98, who's now 100 and doing great.
It's still,
it's still there. And I saw her, she walked in the room. So this is 2 years ago. So it's been 40 years since this event. And she's across the room. Oh, Duffy, great to see you. She comes over. I get a big hug. And then there's this pause, and she backs up and says, so great to see you. Makes me so sad to see you because it's all I think of is that day. So together now, even today, we're both impacted by that event.
And if that wasn't surreal enough and odd enough, then comes the trial, which is downright strange.
Totally.
The Twinkie defense.
So, first Jonestown, 10 days later, the City Hall assassinations.
And did something happen on the day? Was Moscone supposed to be buried on November 22nd?
Well, there was
something happened around that same time.
There was Congressman Ryan had a funeral.
Maybe that was it. Yeah.
That week, right between Jonestown and the City Hall thing,
was
and
it,
it
yeah.
rained, and there were 50 Congress people there.
Yeah.
And Moscone said it was just like Kennedy almost.
Yeah.
It was such a, and that
And I
Friday.
think it was the 22nd, oddly enough.
It was the 22nd.
Yeah, okay.
And that Friday, the 24th, was his 49th birthday.
Okay.
And his horoscope that day said something to the effect of, an acquaintance will be particularly quarrelsome.
Unbelievable. We got about 10 minutes left. You go into the trial.
So White is eventually turns himself in, gets put in jail, and gives a confession in which he said, I lost control, I got hot and bothered. And then he goes on trial in April of 1979. It's about a 2-week trial. Lots of witnesses. The mayor
Did he
testifies.
plead not guilty?
Yes, he did.
But not for insanity, just...
His attorney, Douglas Schmidt, pleaded not guilty by diminished capacity,
Okay.
which was a law that sort of opened the door for some mental case defenses. And he brought in 5 different psychiatrists to testify that White was out of control, he was depressed, he was eating too much sugar, hence the
Twinkie
defense, although the word Twinkie was never actually mentioned in the trial. It came later. But the whole idea was that he really didn't premeditate this. He just kind of went off. And as a cop, he had a gun and he had bullets and he didn't know what he was going to do. So finally, at the end of the trial, he gets convicted.
Would you get convicted of manslaughter?
Convicted of voluntary manslaughter, whereas the DA was shooting for 2 convictions of premeditated first-degree murder.
Since he left with the gun and went to City Hall.
And the death penalty, right.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of other evidence that he was at a boiling point. So this verdict was shocking. It shocked everybody in the city, and no one expected it. And the reason, one of the common reasons is the district attorney thought that by getting a conservative jury that would favor the death penalty, that they had an easy premeditated case, he'd get convicted and get the death sentence. What happened was they got sympathetic to Dan White's frustration with the liberal politics of San Francisco and his inability to get anything done as a conservative. And it took a lot of sympathy with his defense, and they gave him this much lesser conviction. The result was that thousands of people poured out of the Castro and other neighborhoods that night, went down to Civic Center, rioted at City Hall, turned over and burned several police cars, smashed glass in the building at City Hall, and it was called the White Night Riot.
And how long was his original sentence?
It was essentially 5.5 years.
He was out?
Yes.
Yes, but he was sentenced to like 15 or 20.
No.
Really? He was
it was 7.
Was
the
it?
sentence was 7, and he had time served and good behavior and whatever, and he got out in 5.5 years. He went to L.A. to live for about a year and couldn't get comfortable or get a job or whatever it was. He ended up moving back to San Francisco, back in with his wife and child in the Ingleside district. And within a few weeks, he went down to his basement one night and put a hose through his exhaust pipe into the car and killed himself.
Angela Davis, another courtroom story. Did you cover that?
Briefly, just a couple days. Angela Davis was part of, or accused of being part of, the Marin County courthouse shootout in 1970, in which a judge and several other people were killed, and the district attorney was paralyzed, and it was three members of so-called Jackson brothers who was trying to get one of them out of prison.
What at the time, and not unlike the networks at the time, it couldn't have maybe foreseen where we came with cable or with internet. Newspapers, I would assume, admittedly, you would say they're dying as well in terms of the print.
Yes.
Okay.
In today's world? Yeah, absolutely.
How different is journalism now? Is it antiseptic?
It's very different for 2 reasons. One was, obviously, the internet.
Yeah.
And the change in instant communication and the necessity of posting information immediately, and so you don't get beat on a story. And so it leads to mistakes. It leads to people dropping their subscriptions for newspapers. And so the entire industry has suffered because of this for the last several years and continues to do so with layoffs and poor, basically Craigslist helped kill newspapers by taking all the ads out of the paper. So the revenue source was gone.
And the public has become so voracious on wanting the story, true or not. They want immediate.
That's right.
They don't care. Don't check it out. That's all right.
But they want their own media. They want
their own news.
That's right.
This is what we're seeing constantly.
So that's a big factor in the difference between the two. In my foreword of my book, which was written by my good friend Bruce Jenkins, the longtime Chronicle.
Jenkins, who I had on my radio show, and a real quick aside, his dad was Gordon Jenkins,
That's right.
who was an arranger for Sinatra.
Yeah.
Fascinating book as well called Goodbye.
Goodbye, about his father. And he's written other books.
Yeah.
And I'm not the first Chronicle guy to write a book.
Sure.
Joel Selvin has written 14 or 15 books on rock music, facts and people. I may be the oldest guy to write a Chronicle, but I had never seen one done by someone who worked there and talked about what it was like to be inside the newsroom when all of these things were breaking and happening.
Couple of questions out of left field. Most interesting interview. You interviewed Smokey Robinson once, right?
So that was
Was
very
it cool?
interesting because, first of all, I wasn't a reporter yet. This is one of the freelance pieces I did for John Stanley on the date book thing, but I was a big Motown fan. The Miracles came to town on Broadway in 1970, and I said, I'd love to go interview Smokey Robinson. So we set it up with the help of John Wasserman, the late music critic, who put me in touch with their people. They invited me to come to the show, and then the next day I was to go interview Smokey in his room at the Miyako Hotel in Japantown. I get there, I knock on the door. I'm 22 years old. I'm not even officially a reporter at the Chronicle, and yet I'm going to interview Smokey Robinson. I knock on the door, he opens it, and he's wearing a white terry bathrobe. And he said, "Hey, come on in. Hey, great to see you. Oh, how'd you like the show?" And there's some chit-chat, and he's in a bathrobe. And then he says, "Hey, would you mind waiting a bit while I take a shower? And then we can have all the time you want." What am I going to say? I'm going to say, "Sure, I don't mind." So he goes to take a shower. I'm thinking, who can I call to tell
where you are?
You know, I think I said in the book, it's like getting a hole-in-one playing alone.
There's
no one there to attest to this.
That's right.
I can't pick up the house phone.
And it's hard just to say, "Oh, he's in the shower."
So I'm sitting there waiting, and I hear in the background in this singing "Ooh Baby Baby," his classic hit song of that time. Just like any of us are singing in the shower. I did you wrong, my heart went out to play. I'm not going to try to do that falsetto. So that was pretty fun, and we had a nice interview, and then we ran the next day, and I did something really corny at this story. He's talking about, I want to be around a long time. I want to write a lot of songs, and we know he's written hundreds, if not thousands. And so I put this quote in at the end of the story where he says, "I really just want to keep writing songs, all the songs I can think of writing." And so I put down, "Right on, Smokey, right on," with a WR at the end of it, which was corny, but sort of tied into obviously the "right on" expression of the Black Power movement.
Yeah.
And they left it in. He loved it. We had a correspondence for many months afterwards, but I'd say that was a pretty interesting interview.
Did you meet Bill Graham?
I met Bill Graham a couple of times. Frankly, I never got yelled at so much for a story by anyone like Bill Graham. Just tore me a complete new one day because I had referred to him as flamboyant in a story, and he went nuts, and he got me on the phone.
Now, did you go to Fillmore in the old days?
Of course I did.
So you saw Janis there?
I saw them all there.
You saw Hendrix?
Jefferson Airplane, Hendrix, Cream. I mean, you name it. We were there. I mean, this was my era. I lived there. Yes, it was just great, And
Willie, Mickey, and the Duke.
Longshoremen's Hall, the Avalon Ballroom. We were there.
Yeah, that's neat. Well, you're here now, and we're delighted you've joined us. The book is a reporter's notebook. Outside of meeting you and buying it out of your trunk, how do people get it?
So the best way is on Amazon.
Okay.
It's available on Amazon. It's doing quite well there. I've had some fabulous reviews from readers there, all 5-star. They love the read. I'm getting a lot of positive response about the story about my mother and all of that.
The
from
book's
personal
cathartic
side.
to a great extent.
Very cathartic. You know, to do it at this age after 40 years or more, it's a tremendous experience. And it's too long for me to explain to you, but in the book I explain why it took so long and what happened to me in the process. But part of this change in my life came when I moved to Los Gatos in 2006.
Well, if we gave everything away, there'd be no reason to buy the book. Delighted you're here, my friend.
Michael, my pleasure.
Best of luck with
Thanks.
everything. And thank you, folks, for joining us. We're just so happy to bring you this kind of programming. On behalf of myself, the Talk of the Town, and the good folks here at KCAT, look forward to seeing you soon. I'm Jacobi.